Hello and welcome to the Subjective Space with Sindhu Rajasekaran. Today we have an amazing guest, Prachi Gangwani, who is a psychologist. She's a trained yoga teacher and she's the author of this great book called Dear Men. So, welcome, Prachi.
Thank you, Sindhu. Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm going to just quickly read out the blurb of Dear Men so people know, what the book is about, and then we'll sort of delve into it. So, in startling, often revelatory interviews, Dear Men shows how Indian men across ages navigate romantic relationships in a country that is still teetering on the cusp of modern and traditional. Direct, often tongue-in-cheek, accessible, and engaging, the book is an investigation of what sexual boundaries really mean to Indian men, how they deal with online dating, manage traditional gender roles, talk about their mental health, if they think romance is still relevant, and what marriage means to them, and why they hurt the women they love. Well, Dear Men hopes to start an honest and open dialogue with Indian men about subjects that are becoming more and more relevant as movements like Me Too gain traction. So, Prachi, let's start with the question of why you even chose to write this book. Like, what was the inspiration behind that? Can you tell me about that first?
Absolutely. So, this book came from my work at a women's magazine called
Mm-hmm.
iDiva, where I was working as a relationships and sex writer.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, writing a bunch of stories, research pieces, as well as lived experiences of women about romantic relationships, in their romantic relationships. And the magazine catered to
Mm-hmm.
heterosexual women, primarily. So, a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
conversations were around heterosexual relationships. And, over time, talking to a bunch of women, I started identifying, seeing these patterns in their experiences with relationships, in relationships. And I figured, okay, let me start talking to the men. Let me start asking men certain questions about dating and marriage and everything that comes with it. And I got curious about what's going on with the men, right? Because clearly there are patterns. If so many women
Yeah.
are experiencing similar things, that means so many men are doing similar things, and I wanted to know why. So I
Mm-hmm.
started a WhatsApp group. I added, all the men that I knew, friends, invited friends of friends, colleagues, and it just kind of grew from there. Very it started off as a very informal kind of conversation where I would ask them a bunch of questions. I wrote a few articles, and it kind of grew from there. The more conversations that I had with men about romantic relationships, the more I realized that there are a lot of nuances that need to be explored. And I formalized the whole process, and through the interviews, themes emerged. I backed it with research at the time. So I started working on the book back in 2016, I believe, 2016. So
Wow.
it's been quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, there wasn't any conversation around masculinity, but also
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't much research, at least not in India.
Mm-hmm.
So, but whatever, literature I could find around masculinity and how it shows up in relationships, I used that
Mm-hmm.
to inform the book as well. And yeah, that's how it happened. So someone pointed this out a while ago that the book, even though it's about masculinity, it's really written for women.
That's very interesting. So that was actually my next question for you, right? Because I wrote Smashing the Patriarchy, so and I'm queer.
Oh.
Yes, you have it. I'm
Yes.
gonna get a copy of yours. So the thing is that with gender roles, like the patriarchy wants men to behave like super masculine and women to behave super feminine, but that's never the case because we're all a mix. We're all androgynous in many ways. So the pressure that the patriarchy puts on Indian men, like Indian patriarchies put on Indian men to be super masculine, that is traumatic for them as well. It's not just traumatic for the women, like in these heterosexual, the men are sort of forced to be masculine. So you looking into masculinities in the Indian context, like did you, like you said, there was not much research into it. So I don't think people even consciously thought about it. So the men that you were talking to, were they even aware of something like this going on in their
Hmm.
lives?
Hmm. Interestingly, yes, a lot of the men were, a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
men who agreed to interview with me eventually, I guess, were. So my experiences with the interviews, I put it in, two categories. I reached out to a lot of men over the course of a year, year and a half, and there were some men who kind of dodged me, right? Like they would humor me, they would have an initial chat, but then they would bring in their charm and humor and laugh it off. Didn't take the whole process too seriously. But then I came across so many men. I ended up interviewing around 75 men for the book. So that's a fair amount of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so those men that I finally did interview, I found a lot of them to be very candid, and it felt like, they wanted to talk about a lot of these issues that I was bringing up, but they didn't know who to talk to or
Mm-hmm.
where or how, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the men were quite candid. Another thing that I realized about the men who were open about their experiences was that either they had been in therapy, um, and actually these two are the same. So most of the men had had some event, some either a childhood experience or a work related event or a relationship related event that kind of
Mm-hmm.
really hit them and they had to work through it. So some struggle that forced them in a way to look inwards and think about their role, their identity, including masculinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of these men ended up going to therapy for a long time. So they were comfortable with the process of talking, with
Mm-hmm.
opening up. But certainly, I think the men who did agree for the interview and they did open up and they shared their stories, uh, for most of them, there was something, some event or some experience that they had gone through that they wanted to talk about. So that was very interesting. And like you said, there's the gender roles that are a part of the patriarchy and especially masculinity. Sometimes we think that men are not impacted by it, but they really are. And a lot of those issues I speak about in the book. But certainly, they feel boxed in. And one of the themes that came up, which I'd like to share, which is related to this, is that, you know, uh, the patriarchy does not really give too much space to men to explore their identity outside of work, outside of being a breadwinner, being a provider, or just having a work related, a professional identity. So your hobbies, your interests, even your social life, your emotional quotient or intelligence is not developed because it's not expected of you to develop that. And that leads to a lot of distress.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to look at, right? Because society expects men to be the breadwinner traditionally, like in most
Mhm.
patriarchal societies they are. And they have to not just be the breadwinner, but everybody has to be ambitious. Everybody has to be like the top, like 1% of whatever they're doing. And there is that sort of push, especially in India. Like I know, growing up there, like how much so competitive. Everybody has to perform so hard, and men, especially boys, are pushed so hard that they cannot express their gender or even anything beyond just that, right? Like their work and their if they're studying that. So in all of this, obviously there is the primal attraction of being attracted to, because they're talking about heterosexual relationships here, to the opposite sex. And how does that even factor in, right? And especially as women, Indian women are also becoming more and more aware of their own ambitions, their own sexualities and expectations. So did you find that there was an awareness, like among these men, like when they were growing up, or like did they talk about how they often did they have like a box they wanted to put women into, or were they sort of what did they say to you? What was their what experiences like?
Mhm. I think more than wanting to put women in a certain box, so I interviewed men between ages 25 and 40, 45
Mm-hmm.
from urban India. I was very specific about that because I figured that the narrative, from rural India or tier two, tier three cities would be different. And these men, I think, are very kind of progressive. They're very progressive when it comes to their expectations of the women in their lives. But
Mm-hmm.
where they still hold on to these, kind of patriarchal, rigid uh, philosophies or boundaries is when it comes to their expectations of their own selves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're very happy and they want the women in their lives, most of them at least, to be financially independent, to be outgoing, to be sexually liberal and free and comfortable, and to not have to take on responsibility of the house and none of that, right? They're very supportive of the women in their lives, but when it comes to their own role as the man in the relationship, they still want to be the provider and the protector.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this gender gap, when we talk about gender gap, we only kind of tend to think about larger issues or work related issues or, pay gap and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. But this is what I learned working on the book, that there is a huge gender gap when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
romantic relationships as well, because women have been breaking out of, patriarchal norms for much longer than men have even been thinking about it. Men are starting to think about it just now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so men still want to, most men, of course, still want to fill in, the shoe of being the provider and the
Mm-hmm.
protector and the problem solver.
Mm-hmm.
But that role is, um, it needs to evolve, right? Obviously, because women's role in relationships has evolved so much. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that is where the struggle lies when it comes to heterosexual relationships. That's where the
So,
gender gap
so
lies.
I saw a meme or something or a reel or something on Instagram recently about how some woman had put up like my husband really likes to like tell me what to do, right, like in the house, and like they're in a sort of gender equal relationship, so he's putting his foot down on, no, we will not do the dishes first, we will clean the kitchen first, like that's where he wants to show his power, like I'm going to decide, but they're still doing in a sense gender equal work, right?
Yeah.
So it's funny because like you said, women have been breaking out of these these gender roles, and now they're like, we're taking on, like we're working, we're going to make a lot of money, all of that, and but men sometimes feel intimidated by that. I feel like in my research for my book, that came up a
Mhm.
lot. Like a lot of women said, if we sort of get a better position than the person that we're with, not necessarily a husband, but even maybe a boyfriend. And I have had this experience in my own life with boys I've
Mhm.
dated when I was younger, right? Being bisexual. So
Mhm.
some of the boys I dated, like I think they were intimidated by my being competitive, and so they're like, "Are you a girl or are you a boy? What's going on here?" Like,
Yeah.
So there is that. So did any of the men you spoke to, did they speak about this, like the sort of competition now that they have to have with their potential romantic partners
Mhm.
as well?
Mhm. Well, in a way, I think what came up a lot was that, a lot of the men felt that they're being told so much of what not to do, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
don't be abusive, don't be controlling, don't like throw your weight, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But they're not being told what to do. And I think that is the confusion here, right? When you talk about being intimidated by a woman who's taking care of herself financially, physically, and perhaps even emotionally, socially, all of that, right? Um, Men don't know how to show up in the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and that's also something that has been, I think that is changing now slowly, but at least when I was working on the book, this was lacking in the conversation. Men were being given a list of, things that they should not do. They need to stop doing. But there was no conversation around, okay, how do you show up? Now we're starting to talk about, being more emotionally available and vulnerable and, being more involved in the house because it's your house too, not just mine, etc., right? Not helping around the house, but owning the house. So now we're talking about the things that we expect
Mm-hmm.
in a gender equal relationship as well. But earlier it was all, don't do this, don't do that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a part of the, part of feeling why men would feel intimidated by a woman who seems to have it all together and seems to not need a man for the traditional contribution or roles that men have played, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
money, protection, basically that. So it's not knowing, okay, what am I supposed to do? You're making me redundant by providing for your own self. I'm redundant. So obviously that's intimidating for me, right? Because I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what else to bring in here.
Yeah. Like if I'm
Hmm.
not doing the traditional thing, what am I going to do? Like I don't want to, I'm not going to be abusive. I'm not going to be like sexually assaulting you, but then
Yeah,
now what?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, okay, so that brings me to our next question, right? Today is Valentine's Day, and you said you just made a reel about romance. Is romance still, so let me just tell you first, like, I'm a big romantic.
Yeah.
So I don't know what people think about me, but it's like when I fall in love, I'm like dead. Like, it's just like I'm gone. So being that sort of a person, I totally get when people expect romance in their lives and they want that. So but today, because we're all so self-conscious and we don't want to be codependent on anybody, we just want to be like
Mhm.
all like
Yeah.
self-empowered. So for men and women, right, none of us want to depend on anybody emotionally. So in such a world, how does romance sort of come in? Do we still expect that? Do men want it? Do women want it? What is your opinion on this?
Hmm. I'm so glad you're asking this question because this was something that I did a survey for when I was working on Dear Men. I surveyed about 120 people and I asked them about romance and if they think it's relevant or not. And I learned that there are four functions that romance plays in a relationship. So to answer your question, yes, it is relevant and it is important. But also romance is the cherry on the cake, right?
Mhm.
If you don't have a sense of safety in the relationship, then romance really has no value. It's not going to add anything to it, right? But if you feel safe in the relationship, if there's trust and respect and a sense of safety and security, then yes, romance is what enriches a relationship. So it's very important for sure. And I
Mhm.
don't think people should be ashamed or embarrassed of, wanting a little bit of
Yeah.
romance in
I mean,
their
it's
life. It's
cheesy,
it's
right?
what brings. Well,
As,
that's what we're told, but why? Yeah, we
yeah.
should not buy into that.
Mhm.
Yeah, romance is what we do to seduce, the love interest or to keep the one that we're with, right?
Mhm.
And so the four things that I learned that romance, plays a role in is one, to express love or desire or interest. And that's relevant for any stage in the relationship, right? You want to keep letting
Mhm.
your partner know that you still love them and you still desire them and you're interested in them. And
Mhm.
then you also want to break monotony, and romance helps you do that, especially in a long-term relationship. When you've been together
Mhm.
with someone for so long, you gotta just get stuck in the rut. Every day looks the same. And
Mhm.
going out of your way a little bit to do something special is really, it really saves long-term relationships from becoming dry and boring.
Mhm.
um, it's also a way for people to impress the other. And this is more relevant for early stages of the relationship, when you're trying to
Mhm.
create a good impression. And we all do that, right?
Yeah.
No matter the context,
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever the context, even at work we do it. So why not when you're meeting someone new?
Mm.
you know
Mhm.
and then the fourth function that it has is that it helps create new memories. And again,
Mhm.
that's very
Mm.
relevant for long-term relationships because
Yeah.
sense of novelty wears out. So
Mhm.
to just consciously put in a little bit of effort to do things that are novelty and shared experiences are also very important for emotional bonding, right? So
Mhm.
to put
Mhm.
in some effort into doing that is good for your relationship. So it's good. There's
Yeah.
nothing cheesy about it. When you really
Yeah.
understand what it's about and what it can do
Mhm.
to your relationship, I see no reason for anybody to not be romantic, you know?
So did you feel like the men you spoke to also, this is a thing, this is the gendered thing, right? Like we expect, sort of society expects men to be do all the romantic work, like do all the come on the horse, be the knight in armor, like save the woman, give her flowers or whatever. So do you
Yeah.
feel that men have that pressure to like be the sort of romantic hero, especially in Bollywood? We've like, really set the bar very high.
Yes, yes. Yes, that actually works both way in the sense that yes, men I think do feel the pressure to go the extra mile,
Yeah.
to make the first move and all of that. But I think, speaking of Bollywood, since you mentioned that, I remember interviewing somebody who spoke about how he formed his idea of love and relationships based on Bollywood. He was a huge
Mm-hmm.
Shah Rukh Khan
Oh.
fan when he was growing up. Yeah, so it's not just
Okay.
the women.
Yeah. Shah Rukh Khan
Yeah,
is good though. That's a good
yeah.
choice.
Yeah, so he was like, I wanted to be Shah Rukh Khan, right? Like whatever I think he mentioned the character Shah Rukh Khan plays in Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, Rahul, right? He was Rahul in
Mm-hmm.
every movie. So he wanted to be that, and he said when I grew up and when I started dating, this was a real struggle for me because I realized that relationships are not like what they show you in Bollywood. Relationships are really messy. And this is, someone in his 40s, married
Mm-hmm.
now, has a kid. And for him to tell me this, and he really seemed so heartbroken about it, to have
Oh,
discovered that relationships are not, the way they show you in Bollywood. So that was really sweet. So I
yeah,
think there is this pressure to be a certain way, and a lot of it is perpetuated by Bollywood or
right.
movies in general or pop culture in general.
Yeah.
But romance in real life, of
Mm-hmm.
course, is a little different, and it does come with some a little bit of disillusionment as well. You know?
Mhm. I I think that's something we should explore, right? Because this is one thing that in any relationship, like, people expect it to always be happy and great. Like they do not
Mhm.
expect it to go to any other part of the spectrum of a relationship. They expect it to always be the best. So if it's not, and I feel like we're all becoming like bipolar in a sense, in the sense that like if it's not good, it's the worst. Like there is no
Mhm.
in between. There's no like yeah, it doesn't have to be good or bad right now, it's just okay. We just expect it to be okay, or we just assume that it's so bad, right? So is that something you feel people do a lot, like in relationships, where we're just like
Yeah, I think there are a lot of myths about relationships for sure.
mm-hmm,
And some of these myths are perpetuated by pop culture. A lot of these myths are perpetuated by social media. Like, for example, I really don't like this whole conversation around red flags, even though I have contributed to it.
mm,
I've written articles about red flags, but now I know better.
yeah.
Just putting it out there in case someone Googles me and finds my red flag articles, I've learned.
Yeah.
And I think that's that I suppose that's the lesson that in relationships also we evolve, right? And
Mm-hmm,
sometimes we evolve through we have to go through challenges. There will be challenges. Think of it this way. You're putting two grown adult individuals together, in an intimate setting. These two individuals have their own relationship maps and love maps and sex
mm-hmm,
maps, their own histories and fears and insecurities and experiences that they come
mm-hmm,
with, right? No two people have the same model of relation or completely identical model of relationship or love. So when you put any two people together, no matter how healthy they may be as individuals, or no matter how healthy the relationship may be, there's
mm-hmm,
going to be some friction, you know? And I think because the culture today is so intolerant of discomfort in general,
mm-hmm,
that kind of ripples into relationships as well. I do feel that perhaps we are becoming intolerant of discomfort. But
mm-hmm,
put any two people together, think about any relationship in your life, whether that's with a family member, colleague, or friend, even your best friend, you're
mm-hmm,
going to have friction. That is a part of relationships. So to expect that things will always be rosy, is definitely misinformed. But I think the intolerance is a larger cultural phenomenon.
mm-hmm.
And because romantic relationships matter to everyone, right? This is where we kind of internalize it more than in other places.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we expect this to be that sort of touchstone or like a safe space for us, like where we can just be ourselves with our partner. And
Hmm.
we romanticize it, and we make
Yeah.
it like this perfect space. Or anything that's not perfect there, or rosy, we immediately assume. So this is the next question I had for you is about obviously a lot of people that you must have spoken to must be in monogamous relationships. Did you also find people who are perhaps not married and who are still dating, who are exploring, say biomory or polyamory or something like that in India, which I've come across a lot when I was doing my book. So
Hmm.
many women are doing it, and I'm like, wow, amazing. So did men that you spoke to, are they also doing it, or is that sort of frowned upon? And if somebody is in a sort of polyamorous or biamorous relationship,
Hmm.
how do they deal with their own sort of selves? How do they distribute
Yeah.
themselves?
Hmm. Yeah. I did interview a few men, like I mean, or rather, a few of the men that I interviewed were some of them who were dating, weren't ready to commit, and were,
Hmm.
dating multiple people. I also came across a couple of married men who had multiple relationships. However, I would not call that polyamory because their wives
Hmm.
didn't know, so that's
Oh,
straight out
okay. That's a
cheating,
totally
right?
different
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
Okay.
One person, though, tried to explain to me why it's not cheating,
Hmm.
even though his wife didn't know. So for him, in his mind, he was polyamorous and not, cheating on his wife. But that's a separate thing, right?
But
But
what
yes,
was his thing? You have to tell us now that you said it. What
oh
was
gosh,
his
you'll
reasoning?
have to read the book. It was like he cited a bunch of literature and told me that monogamy is not natural, for human beings, which I agree
Which
with.
I
And
agree with
I
too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's fine. Monogamy is not natural. So he gave me all the right arguments, that we
Yeah.
cannot be monogamous. It's not natural to us. And there's this literature, this book that I read, this scholar who said this, da 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 da. And I heard him out for a whole hour, hour and a half. And at the end of which I asked him, so what does your wife think about this?
Yeah.
And he's
Oh
like, oh, she,
no.
she doesn't know. And I'm like, oh, so you're not polyamorous, you're
Yeah.
cheating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing how I find we're all trying to sort of give ourselves the pass. Like we're just trying to be like, we are fine, I'm not doing
Yeah.
anything wrong here. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Okay, so
Yeah.
go on. Sorry, I cut you short. You were
No,
talking about
that's fine.
um
Yeah. So early stages of a relationship, or even men who are dating, not yet ready to commit to a long-term relationship, or even an exclusive relationship, doesn't have to be long-term. I think the assumption now is that unless you have a conversation with somebody about being exclusive, you're not exclusive
mm-hmm,
you know I think that is the assumption now. So yes, there is a lot more openness and acceptance about
mm-hmm,
polyamory,
mm-hmm,
um, for a certain age group. I
mm-hmm,
would like to add that. I think if you go past 35, 40,
mm-hmm,
um, of course, monogamy is not natural to us, right? Some people find it easier to be monogamous and some people don't. I have also come to understand that polyamory is more a sexual orientation, closer to a sexual orientation than it is a life choice. And
mm-hmm,
in polyamorous relationships, sometimes what happens is that one person, for one person, polyamory may be more of a sexual orientation, but for
mm-hmm,
their partner, they are put in a position where monogamy is something they're more comfortable with,
mm-hmm,
but they may be confronted with this choice, and they may choose to be polyamorous. That's absolutely fine as well. But these two experiences of polyamory are very different. For the
mm-hmm,
first, it's much easier. It's much more natural. They
mm-hmm,
feel much more at peace. Whereas for the second, it comes with a lot of questions, insecurities, jealousy, etc. And you make room for all of that in the relationship to help you navigate it. Coming back to the book and the men I interviewed, what I realized was that when you're dating,
mm-hmm,
it is assumed that you're not
mm-hmm.
exclusive unless you have a conversation about it. So, yes, a lot of the younger men that I
Yeah.
interviewed who weren't in a committed relationship or an exclusive relationship
Mm-hmm,
were, on multiple dating apps and talking to and dating and meeting multiple women. And that's fine.
mm-hmm.
That's just the dating culture now, too, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So now I want to, we spoke about relationships all this while and men. So now I want to
Mhm.
sort of talk to you more about the individual, whether they're man, woman, whatever,
Mhm.
about, people and our own brains and our heads. So I was just going to ask you about, because in our culture, relationships are given such high value. Like we are meant to be good in our relationships. Like
Mhm.
that's the expectation, right? Like
Mhm.
you're dating or you're married or whatever, everybody expects you to be good at it. So in all of this, how do we preserve our own mental sanity? Because sometimes I feel people lose themselves in relationships, like they're
Yeah.
pleasing somebody so much that they're losing their own sense of self or ideas that they were holding on to, right? So in
Mhm.
your experience and your work, how would you what would you suggest, how do people preserve their own mental sanity while being in a relationship?
Yeah. I think if somebody has people-pleasing tendencies, definitely go to therapy and work through it. You know,
Mm.
it usually stems from our childhood experiences, you
Mm.
know, and that is something that will impact other areas of your life as well. If it's showing up in your relationships, it is in some way impacting other areas of life as well. So definitely go to therapy and work through it.
Mhm.
I think it's very important to find some avenue. If therapy is not it for you, if you don't feel comfortable or you don't have access to it or can't afford it or whatever, I think it's very, very important to have some avenue or some sort of a space that you create for yourself where you keep coming back to yourself, right? Keep
Mhm.
checking in with yourself. That can be a physical practice, that can be a group of friends that you can really be honest with. Um, ha- that can be any space really. That can be rituals or activities that we do, like
Mhm.
journaling or um, not giving up on your interests and hobbies. I think that's another part of, being the pleaser in the relationship or
Mhm.
in life in general is that we always put our interests on the back burner to fit
Mhm.
into certain roles. So you want to be very conscious about that and not do that and push yourself to not do that. I think
Mhm.
there also comes a lot of guilt when we try to assert ourselves when we've been
Mhm.
brought up in a culture where we're not allowed to do that, right? And one has
Mhm.
to learn to work through that guilt as well. So it's a process, and there's no one size fits all. It's a
Mhm.
it's a long process, and uh, this is something that you see, you recognize as an adult, and that means that you've learned this over decades, right?
Mhm.
So for you to unlearn this and learn a new way of relating to yourself and others will also take time and
Mhm.
conscious work. So do the work is what I would
Mhm.
say.
I think also the next thing I want to ask you is touching on the same thing, but also a little to do with, say, our work pressures and all of that. I think, in our 20s, everyone's like just working hard at whatever they're doing. And then later in their 30s, everyone's having this sort of existential dilemma of like, who am I? Like a midlife crisis, so to speak. But we got it way earlier than like earlier generations.
Yeah.
So it's like everyone's going through this anxiety or this existential dilemma of who am I? What am I doing? Where am I going? Sort of a thing. Again, you would say therapy is a great way to make sense of it, but I think also what's happening is a lot of people are put the pressure comes onto the partner, right? Whoever
Mm-hmm.
they're with, they are expected to help this person to navigate this sort of, and when they themselves are also very lost in their own heads, and
Yeah.
so there are these two lost souls trying to figure out
Yeah.
what are we doing, and there's so much pressure on each other. So
Mm.
how do you think people can be in love, people can respect and care for each other, but at the
Mm.
same time also have this like you're another person, I'm another person, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And again, that's a balance that is so difficult to achieve. It's very difficult to achieve, right?
Mm-hmm.
But one has to understand that, uh, a partner is a support system, um, but not someone who can, come in and solve your problems for you. And I think this becomes more difficult to understand and accept also for men. This is
Mm-hmm.
another part of their identity that they struggle with because they've been conditioned to be the problem solver, right? So also for men to step out of that role and let
Mm-hmm.
the women or whoever their partner is, whether it's a male partner, female partner, any gender, right? A parent, whoever, let the
Mm-hmm.
people in their life figure their own stuff out on their own is difficult for men as well, right? But wherever you are in the spectrum, I think a lot of women are also problem solvers, right? It just comes naturally. You want to
Yeah.
just, you know, get in there and make your loved one feel better, do whatever you can. But we need to stop doing that for each other. We need to understand that certain problems are for the individual, and your partner can support you through it, but not do it for you, not do it on your behalf. One analogy I like to give the people that I work with is that your relationship, and assuming it's a two-person relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can add as many more as you want to it. But in a two-person relationship, your relationship and the two individuals are kind of like a Venn diagram, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is individual one, individual two, and then there's the relationship, which is its own identity.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some areas that will overlap but there are large chunks in each of these which don't overlap. So one has to then identify what's mine, what's my partner's, and what belongs to the relationship and work through
Mhm.
it in that or with that lens and awareness.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it, because that's the thing. Like, we are two people coming together, and there is some stuff that's common to both of us, but there is so much more that's not. And
Yeah.
and we are always going to be those people. So it's like we can't expect our partners to solve all our problems. We shouldn't, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
Self-healing is so important, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and speaking about self-healing, so do you find that in India, people that you work with, do you find that outside of even relationships, people, even people who are in relationships, do they find a lot of value in self healing and trying to heal themselves for themselves and not just for somebody else? Is that something that's happening, do you think?
Hmm. I think, in India, there are a lot of opportunities to do that. Like India
Hmm.
is a very spiritual country, right?
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, I think spirituality, faith, religion
Mm-hmm.
is a source of self-healing and comfort, you know. Um, and that's okay. I mean, I'm not religious personally, so um, I I I don't understand it at a visceral level, at an
Hmm.
emotional level, but I understand it at an intellectual level that there
Hmm.
can be value in that. But what we want to be careful, and there's so many other practices as well, right? Like
Hmm.
yoga.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Which
I've,
you
I've
also
been,
teach. Yeah.
I also teach, so I'm very familiar with the yoga community, and a
Hmm.
lot of people come with, just carrying a lot of emotional pain, and they
Hmm.
find comfort and healing in the practice,
Hmm.
you know. And I think that's wonderful. Like, why not?
Yeah,
If there is a
absolutely.
practice,
I agree with
yeah.
you. Like, I think religion, all the bad rep that it has, and it rightly should, but it also
Mhm.
provides people a space to sort of, heal themselves in a very spiritual way with whatever it is that they're doing,
Yeah,
rituals, or it could be communing, meditating, doing all of
yeah,
that. I think that that's true. It doesn't have to be therapy, like you said, right? There are so many
yeah,
different ways that people can
yeah.
approach.
Yeah, I do want to add a word of caution here, though. I think
Mm,
sometimes what tends to happen with these spiritual or
mm,
faith-based practices, or even, body-related somatic practices, is
mhm.
that sometimes one tends to, I don't know how to put it, but okay, let me put it this way. Sometimes when one tends to become overly accepting of things that they do not need to tolerate, you know.
Mm,
Um, For example, you do not need to tolerate abuse in a relationship. If there is
mhm.
abuse in a relationship, you should get out, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I understand the challenges, the systemic challenges, the personal challenges when
Mm,
it comes to that. So, acknowledging that, but still, you don't need to accept it, right?
mhm,
You
mhm.
don't need to accept a toxic work environment. You don't need
Mm.
to, there's so many things that you
Yeah.
should feel enraged about. And I
Mm,
think sometimes with these spiritual, faith-based
mm,
or body-based practices, one is, one becomes, one lets go of their anger, or not lets go, one suppresses their anger when they
mm,
shouldn't, you know.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
that's
that's a great
something,
cautionary thing to say, I think. That's absolutely true, right? Because in a sort of this space where there is therapy, people are made to confront and challenge these situations. But in these sort of these spaces, they're just made to accept it, like not question it too much, just be like, this is, and sort of be
yeah,
this the trope of self-sacrifice, that all those tropes come in and then they're like
yeah,
abusing themselves. True.
yeah.
So, talking about this, let me bring us back to Dear Men. And first
Mhm.
off, it's very nice that you called it Dear Men. It's so sweet. It's like it makes people want to be like, okay, I'm gonna. It's like a nice, sweet way to say it. So, talking about we spoke about, like, toxic work environments or like abuse in relationships. Obviously, it's not just women who go through these things. Men also have the same experiences of toxic work relationships, or like, abuse, all of those things. So, as women, I think this is for women, I'm saying, like, I feel the feminist future is also about care. is also
Mhm.
about being taking care of everybody, in the sense that making good spaces, right? So I want to know how we can, as women, help men, how do we be nice to them and take care of them, and what are the sort of challenges that you see men having nowadays?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I think the first thing I would say is create a safe space, emotionally a safe space for men to open up.
Hmm.
Um, and this is related to one of the challenges that I feel men face, which is being emotionally vulnerable and opening up. Right? It's very difficult for them because they've never been taught how to. In fact, they have been actively discouraged from doing so, right?
Hmm.
They've actively been told to man up, ladke rote nahi hai and all that, right? So I think a lot of men experience not just discomfort, but also shame when it comes to opening up emotionally. And sometimes what happens is that inadvertently, women shut the men down by either being dismissive or, being shocked. I think we also are not used to seeing men being vulnerable. So we kind of
Hmm.
feel shocked and we don't know how to respond. We don't know
Hmm.
how to hold space. So learn to hold space and learn to, let men be vulnerable without expecting them to be anything, right? They can be
Hmm.
vulnerable in any way that they want. Also, I think women need to learn to hold men accountable without attacking.
Hmm.
You know, very difficult to do. It requires a lot of practice, fine balance, and all of that. But uh, hold men accountable. Sometimes we don't hold men accountable again because we'll say things like, "This is how men are." Men get
Hmm.
angry. Men are not socially whatever.
Hmm.
Um, so hold men accountable. Be
Hmm.
gentle about it. Be nice about it, but call it out. When
Hmm.
you see
Hmm.
something that's or when someone does something that hurts you, or when you want them to do a little bit more, or when you see promises broken, whatever it is, hold them
Hmm.
accountable. That's the other thing that I would say. Yeah, I think just these two, and these two things are very difficult to do, I understand, so I won't say more
Yeah.
that women
Yeah.
should do,
But they
you know
definitely should make that space for men to be vulnerable. Like you rightly
yeah.
said, even for a lot of women, it's so hard to see. Oh, they want men to be like less, whatever they are, but they don't want them to be super vulnerable either. Then it sort of shakes them up and like,
Yeah,
why is he crying? Like, calm down. Like, just, because women also have double standards. We have to accept that.
yeah,
Like, we want
yeah,
men to be equal, gender equal, whatever, whatever. But there are women who want their partners, their men, to be also like the superhero
yeah,
who saves everything. Like,
yeah,
and that becomes a thing. Like, you're not man enough.
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's sad but true. But you're
yeah,
you're right. It's important to hold that emotional space.
yeah, yeah. And not just for vulnerability, but also I think honesty. This was something that came up in my interviews a lot.
Hmm.
Was that, men sometimes find it difficult to be honest with the women in their lives because they're afraid of the consequences, which
Hmm.
I think is work that both men and women need to do, in the
Hmm.
sense that men need to not do things then that, women are going to be so upset about, right? But also at the same time, I think women need to be mm, just again create more space for honest conversation. And a lot of that comes from being less emotionally, um, I don't want to say dependent, but uh, codependent. When you're
Hmm.
in a codependent relationship, then honesty can feel very threatening.
Hmm.
But when you have healthy dependence, which
Hmm.
means that you can tolerate the idea of your partner not being there,
Hmm.
honesty becomes easier, you know.
Right.
Um, so healthy dependence again is necessary in relationships. Uh, and go back to that Venn diagram, right?
Hmm.
There is a huge part of your identity which exists outside of this relationship, and keep that strong so that
Hmm.
whatever is in the relationship can be strong, right?
Hmm. That's a nice way of putting it. So we have very little time left, so I'm going to ask you one last question, and then
Mhm.
we'll wrap it up. And my last question is again about men and about, like we spoke about, how it's important to give them that space to be vulnerable and to be honest and not be offended by their, vulnerability and honesty. Because
Mhm.
I feel like there are few good men in the world. We need to protect them and create more, such men in the world. We need more men like
True.
that. So, sorry, did you get cut off?
I lost you there for a second.
Oh, no, I
Yeah.
was just
You're
saying
back
that
now.
there are few good men in the world. We need to protect them. And
Hmm.
we also need to make space for more such men to be in the world, right? So
Yeah.
that's why you writing this book called Dear Men is so nice, because it's important for us to understand men's perspectives in that sense, to see what are they really trying to achieve here. So, as a true-blooded feminist, I'm going to ask you, why should we why should we sort of like men, trust men? Why give them space? Tell me some good things about men here. Like, say some things that are nice that I want to hear before I say bye.
That's a tough one.
Just three
No,
things. You can tell
I'm
me three
kidding.
good things about.
Um, well, I think that um, three good things about men. Okay, let me answer this a little bit later. I want to say one thing before that, and I'll be
Hmm.
quick because I know we're running out of time. Is that, the young boys are very sensitive, they're very needy, they're hungry for love and attention, right?
Hmm.
But because of gender roles and gender stereotypes and expectations of the patriarchy, young boys, as they grow older, they're discouraged from being emotionally expressive, right?
Hmm.
And I think this is at the heart of men's goodness. There is, they are, they, the child, the inner child that every man has is hungry for love and acceptance, right? But that inner child over years, because of conditioning, is suppressed, suppressed, suppressed. And then
Hmm.
that inner child becomes angry.
Hmm.
The child who's locked up in the room, asking for love, not being given love, grows up to be the angry young man, right?
Hmm.
So that I think is at the heart of goodness of men.
Hmm.
Men, when they're given the space to love and be loved, have a lot to give and receive, right? So
Hmm.
tap into that. So I'll just say one thing, and I hope
Hmm.
it is meaningful enough. Uh, but yeah, I think that's really at the heart of it. The
Yeah.
good men are
Yeah.
the ones who have been given the space to be vulnerable, to be loved, to give love, and have not been
Hmm.
shamed for that. So,
Hmm. I think that's a lovely way to put it. I think that sort of encompasses the whole thing, right? Because like we are mothers, we are, women are, nurturers. So also, so I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Thank you so much, Prachi. I think that was a great chat. So thank you so much for joining us. So I'm going to say bye to you. Bye. Take
thank
care and happy
you.
Valentine's
You
Day.
too. And to you.
Okay, I'm just